In this special bonus episode of Inside the Outside, I'm going to be talking to Avery Flynn about our recent paddle trip in South Carolina. Avery is the owner of Outdoorsman Outfitters and, like me, was a newbie to distance kayaking. We both made some of the same mistakes in preparing or, well, not preparing for this trip. We talk about what we learned, what we would do different the next time, and our favorite parts of the trip. We hope this will not only entertain you, but help you when you're preparing for your next trip on the water. So I'm sitting here with Avery Flynn of Outdoorsman Outfitters, and he was one of the paddlers on this Paddle for Kids trip. Avery, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
So for the listeners that aren't familiar with you or your company, tell me a little bit about yourself and Outdoorsman Outfitters.
Yeah, well, I'm a hiker, a backpacker, and a camper. My parents and my grandparents got me into camping at a very early age. And it wasn't actually until I was about 17 that I started getting into the world of backpacking. Now, Outdoorsman Outfitters came about because of a backpacking trip that I took with a friend of mine over a pillow. And I was just unhappy with the inflatable pillow, so I came home and designed what is now the Cloud9 pillow. And from there, it has stemmed into more outdoor gear, hammocks and underquilts, etc. So that's kind of how Outdoorsman Outfitters got started in a nutshell.
Nice. So what all type of gear do you supply now? I know you said it started over a pillow, but you've obviously got more things on your store now. So what all do you cover?
Yeah, so we're primarily a hammock gear company, but we do make a range of outdoor gear, hammocks, underquilts, top quilts, rain flies, little ditty bags, feed bags for going on the chest of your backpack when you're hiking out on the trail. We also have some sit pads and some various other things. It's a pretty broad range of gear for hammocks, mainly.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to include a link to your website in the show notes. So I'm curious, starting out on this trip, you and I were definitely the least experienced of the four on this trip. Going into it, I know you've paddled before, so had I, but it was very eye-opening, to say the least.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, what did you do to prepare for this?
Well, if I said I had done really any preparation at all, I would be lying.
Oh, I love hearing that because I didn't know preparation either. I did some push-ups thinking, this will be good. But yeah, doing some push-ups each day, for 2 weeks before the trip, that's not really preparing.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of had an idea that it would be difficult and it would be probably one of the most difficult things that I had done so far in my life, but I didn't really know how to prepare for it, nor did I really have the time just dealing with Outdoorsman Outfitters. So, I gathered up all of my supplies and, put together all the necessary equipment that I thought I would need for the trip. But other than that, it's pretty much all the preparing that I did. I didn't even actually have a touring kayak to do the trip with. So finding one was quite an interesting challenge. And thankfully, there were some very nice folks at Get Outdoors that were willing to sponsor us with the trip and provide us with the rentals.
Yeah, that was actually really cool. You ended up with a nice boat to do the trip in. So I'm curious, you said that you knew going into this it would be challenging, possibly one of the toughest things you had ever done in your life. Did it live up to those expectations?
I would definitely say yes. It lived up to all the expectations that I had for the trip and more. It was very hard, but it was well worth it. And I'm very glad that I had the experience to look back on.
Yeah, I would agree with the delivered and some more. There was a whole lot more at times, almost overwhelming at times. I think the most memorable of the, giving a little more was the time you and I spent on Lake Moultrie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Lake Moultrie was not fun.
If I were to go back and do this trip again, I would have no shame setting out that leg of the trip.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. I've done it. I've been there. I saw it. I got the T-shirt. I don't need to do it again.
You and me both. I've got pictures of us doing it. So, if anybody wants to call us out, I can prove we did it, And I would challenge anybody to go out there and do it and walk away and say, wow, I can't wait to do that again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, it's just not going to happen.
So that was probably the most challenging. What was your favorite part of this trip or parts?
Honestly, I have a lot of favorite parts of this trip, but I think my favorite experience or part of the trip was getting to know you and getting to know Scott and Raul better, and the camaraderie that we shared throughout the trip. I also really enjoyed that every day that we got up and we got out on the water, we were going to end somewhere different with new scenery and just being able to explore and adventure and see things I had never seen before. I had actually never been to a swampy area like that before, so that was quite an experience for me.
Yeah, I had never been, I guess, to that degree in something that had all of these cypress groves and all this Spanish moss. You see it a little bit here and there, when you're traveling around and maybe vacationing in certain areas, but we were in it. We lived there and were part of that particular ecosystem for a little while. And I thought that was really cool.
For sure. You really don't get an appreciation for what it's like until you've spent the night out there, or several nights in our case. It's very different from what you see in pictures and videos, but it's awesome.
I thought it was interesting too, as you mentioned, getting to know each other, because prior to this trip, I had met Scott at a hanging event last year and then talked to him several times on the phone. But when you get out on a trip like this and you live with each other for a week and you depend on each other for your livelihood and safety for a week, you walk away family. We walked away as brothers from that trip, I feel like.
Oh, I totally agree. This is the kind of trip that you go on and you either make lifelong friends or you come away hating each other.
Yeah, there was always the potential for either one, but I'm glad to say that we all walked away happier and better and tighter for it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. We're family now.
So when it come to experiences on the trip, what did you learn from this that you didn't know going into it?
I had really only had very little experience with fishing kayaks on our local lake here in Georgia, Lake Lanier. So I learned a whole lot about kayaking. I learned differences between, different boats and why you'd use one boat over another boat in a particular situation. But really, I think the main thing that shocked me was, I could carry so much more stuff, things that I just can't take when I go backpacking. I packed for this trip like a backpacker would, taking the essentials. But as I learned from Scott very quickly, that you can take, more things with you. You can have these little luxuries and things out there. So that was quite a surprise to me, and something I'll definitely bear in mind for next time. A kayak is sort of like a pack mule. You can take with you some luxuries to make that trip easier and really help you out along the way and keep your morale up.
Yeah, I agree. I did the same thing when I was preparing my supplies for this trip. I approached it like a backpacker. I was very weight conscious when it came to the food. It was primarily Mountain House meals and little bagged up snack meals, things like that. But when we got there and realized, hey, you can have a big cooler strapped to the back of this with some ice and put some perishable things in there. We fried up steaks one night. You don't typically get to do that on a backpacking trip, which also it presented an interesting challenge. I know you mentioned it one morning. We were talking about breakfast, and you really weren't eating much for breakfast because all of your meals were requiring you to boil water, and everybody wanted to just get up and get on the water really quick. So you didn't have time to do that in the morning.
Yeah. No, I didn't. I was, in that aspect, definitely unprepared for the trip. I expected that I would have time to boil water in the morning as I usually do when I'm going backpacking. But because this trip was really a speed trip, we were trying to get it done, trying to get to the coast, and we did do it in 7 days, and I'm happy that we accomplished our goal. We just didn't have the time to do that in the morning. So if I did this again, and I probably will, I would definitely bring some more things that I can either cold soak in the morning or cold soak overnight, and things that are just easy access, ready to go in the morning. I think if you did this trip and you were doing it for leisure, that it would be perfectly fine to do the normal things we do in the morning as backpackers. We boil water, make breakfast, have coffee, those sort of things. But this was definitely a different animal.
Yeah, I agree. The leisure aspect would, open itself up to that. If I did this trip again, which again, like you said, I intend to do it. I'll take advantage of that cooler option and have other items. Like I noticed Raul, when he needed something to eat, he could just easily whip out a sandwich, make it fresh right there. Whenever we got our portage and made a pit stop at Taco Bell, I'll tell you what, the next day, having those leftover burritos on ice, rather than, dipping a spoon into peanut butter or eating a granola bar, it was nice to have a little chicken burrito.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It was awesome having that out on the water. Pull out a burrito and on the live stream on Facebook, and people are commenting on there, "Are you eating Taco Bell in the middle of nowhere?"
As a matter of fact, I am. Are there any things that you didn't pack on this trip that you wish you had?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had brought a chair with me. I think that's probably one of my biggest regrets, is not bringing a chair with me.
Same.
Just for sitting around at camp at night.
Scott was the only one that had a chair, and man, I was jealous.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we should have brought a chair, that's for sure.
Next time.
Next time, for sure.
I tell you, something that I would bring next time is a water bladder. We were using the little bottles of water, which totally worked out. But I think the simplicity of being able to fill up like a 3-liter water bladder and have it behind your seat with a little hose there where you could just grab a sip anytime you wanted would have made it a whole lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I do wish I had brought that now that you mention it.
I always use the rule of thumb whenever I come back from a trip. If I didn't use it on the trip outside of my first aid kit, I won't bring it on the next trip. Did you bring anything home that you're like, I'm not going to bring that next time?
Honestly, I can't say that I did. I believe I didn't bring enough because I was packing for the trip, like I said, like a backpacker would. And I've got my system pretty fine-tuned, so I don't really bring anything that's not essential and that I don't use. So, no, I think I probably would bring all of what I brought and maybe a little bit more on the next trip.
For the biggest part, I would agree with that. The one change that I would make, we kind of already touched on it, and that was food. I did come home with a lot of Mountain House meals and little snack bags that I had made because we ended up being able to get Taco Bell on one of our pit stops. And Scott's wife, April, was kind enough to bring a huge pile of Bojangles fried chicken to us on one stop. Having the cooler to have perishable items, I would definitely rethink my food and pack differently there. I probably would bring less of the freeze-dried stuff and more either perishable or ready-made items that didn't require any preparation.
Yeah, absolutely. I was definitely shocked with how little I actually ate out of the food that I brought.
You and me both. I have a huge pile of food that I ended up not eating, but I also ate very well. I think we all ate really well on the trip.
Yeah, we did. We did for sure. We were able to bring a whole lot more perishable items, like you said, and keep things in the cooler. And so that helped a whole lot and made it so that we didn't really have to use what we brought with us.
Yeah, I think I would probably bring some drink mixes too, because I wanted the water, but I'll be honest, toward the end of the trip, I wanted something with some flavor. And when we finally hit that finish line, I couldn't wait to drink a beer. I like a good beer to begin with, and that beer had never tasted so good.
It never does. Nothing tastes as good as when you come off the water or you're out camping.
Yeah, that. And then Scott and I went and grabbed cheeseburgers, and man, a cheeseburger and a beer. That was awesome. So a few things that I started trying to make a list of what I would recommend people having as like a must-have thing if you're going to do this trip. I'm curious, are there any things like, what are some of the top items that come to mind when you say, if you're going to do this trip, you have to have it? For me, stuff like a good sunscreen and lip balm with a good SPF in it, sunglasses, wide brim hat, stuff like that. What are some of your essentials that you would have to have?
I definitely would have to have a large brimmed hat and my buff. The sunscreen is a must out there. You will burn in anywhere that you don't apply it. And if you miss a spot, you will know it the next day. I'd definitely say I'd have to bring a ground sheet to go underneath my hammock. If you're a hammock camper and you don't bring a ground sheet, you are missing out on so much. Just having that extra space to be able to spread out and organize your gear and know that it's not on the ground collecting ticks or bugs to find later on is a wonderful feeling. It's a simple piece of gear to add to your kit, but definitely an essential one.
So true. A couple others that I'd not even given thought to was a sponge and the rain skirt. When you're out there, from my years of canoeing, it wasn't a big deal to get a little splash of water in the canoe or, even a good splash of water. But when you're out there locked into this kayak, having a sponge to be able to pad out any of those splashes that come in there, or even better yet, when you get those rains or the big swells, having a rain skirt. Gosh, I was so glad that I had mine, and at times I was feeling really bad that you didn't have them or have one, just because, like on Lake Moultrie, multiple times you had to stop, and thank God you had a bilge pump so that you could empty the water out. It's easy to get too much water in a kayak.
Absolutely it is, and I would definitely say that that's another essential item, and I am not happy that I did not have one, but I'm glad I made it through the trip.
Yeah, you have to have a plan, and you have to have a partner too. Something Scott and I discussed was, well, actually all of us discussed it at some point or another. You don't want to do this trip alone. You need to have partners, and you need to stick together and be there for each other. You really do depend on each other for your livelihood and your safety.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was one point that we were literally locked arms, kayaks beside each other, filtering our water, and that just wouldn't have been possible if we weren't right there beside each other. So partners is definitely a must. Don't do this trip alone.
Yeah. You also brought up, with your ground cloth, being able to, separate everything and be able to, check for ticks or prevent ticks. There was a lot of ticks on this particular trip, and, I would have good bug spray with you, but also treating your clothes and your camp gear and whatever with permethrin before you ever go out there. I was kind of shocked how many ticks we saw this time. Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of insane. We have a lot of ticks here in Georgia and on the trails that I hike a lot, but I don't think I've ever seen so many ticks in one spot. No, the one place that I've now dubbed Tick Island was not a great place. It was a beautiful campsite. I loved the location, being out on an island in a lake. That's sort of magical. But there's monsters in those woods.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Treat your clothes and bring a tick key, especially if you're doing this trip. Bring a tick key, because if you do get a tick, you don't want to have to pull that thing out with a pair of pliers. No,
you did that for me. I really appreciate that. But We also had to heat up a lighter, and now I have this beautiful Bic lighter brand on my spine. So I have a memory. You had mentioned maybe getting a tattoo or something to commemorate the trip. I have a Bic lighter brand on my back.
Yeah. Just be smart about it. Bring a tick key. Don't go do this trip without a tick key.
We've both indicated that we would do it again. Are there any things that you would change about it? Would you want to do more miles? Would you change the start and stop points? Anything about the trip you'd modify?
I would definitely make sure that we had a support boat for going across Lake Moultrie if we didn't omit that part of the trip entirely. I know we make it sound like lighthearted, but it was a bear to conquer. I mean, we were out there in 6-foot swells with 15, 20 mile an hour headwinds. And if we hadn't all been right there together, it could have gotten very bad and very dangerous in a hurry.
No, I totally agree. Having a support boat for Lake Moultrie, and also too in the harbor. The harbor was similar to Lake Moultrie in that, you had the swells and you had the winds, and it was sort of a crosswind, which made it that much harder. It wanted to blow you out to sea. And then you have these gigantic floating cities, called, cruise ships and battleships all floating around you. It was a little bit scary at times when you look and see how insignificant you are compared to these monsters that are floating around you. I wouldn't have minded having a support boat at the harbor as well.
No, not at all. We definitely should have a support boat for doing this trip next time.
If you had to advise anybody in preparing for this trip, whether it's physically or mentally, do you have any final parting words of wisdom for anybody that's considering something like this?
I don't want to discourage anybody from trying this trip because I definitely think it's one that if you can, you should do. It's well worth it. But don't do what I did and make this your very first kayaking trip ever. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it certainly adds a level of difficulty to it if this is your first trip.
I think those are excellent words to give anyone. I won't call it a mistake, but I made a similar decision to you in that I had been in a canoe for many years, but I had only been in a kayak 2 days prior to setting sail on this trip. And we are living proof that it can be done with very, very little experience, but I would not recommend doing that for anyone. You need to get out there. You need to do some practicing. Don't let this be your maiden voyage.
Yeah. In the words of Scott Buff, we did something and hope nothing bad happened and got away with it.
I think that's Scott's mantra. Well, Avery, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I'm sure that our listeners are going to enjoy this conversation, and hopefully we can get out on the water again or even on the trail somewhere very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Inside the Outside is proudly brought to you by Terrapin Outfitters. Terrapin Outfitters is an innovative company that specializes in developing clothing and gear that enhance people's enjoyment of outdoor activities. Check them out at terrapinoutfitters.com.
And follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Look for the handle Inside the Outside Show.
For links to our social media and other stuff that we talk about in the show, be sure to check out the show notes and our website, InsideTheOutsideShow.com.